Hi, I'm Jake Ray, and today on the Student Slant, we talk to Nerissa Young, a lecturer at the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University, about reporting on suicide.
I got interested in covering suicide and the effects on the community and also on journalists after I covered the suicide of a young man I knew. I worked in a rural area and knew 3 generations of his family. Joe had suffered a traumatic brain injury as a result of a car wreck. A drunken driver crossed the median and hit the subcompact Joe was riding in, and they were going to the beach for Thanksgiving break. And I kept waiting for the opportunity to write the story of when Joe would return to college. And instead, I was left to write the 5-paragraph brief without a byline that he had taken his own life. It had a great effect on me. It took me a long time to deal with it on a human level and also a journalist level. I wrote a lot of difficult stories, but that one probably was one of the most difficult because I had tears rolling down my cheek the whole time, thinking, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And the answer kept echoing back in my head, because it's my job, because it's my job. My name is Nerissa Young. I'm a lecturer in the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism.
I'm Jake Ray.
I'm Zach Varda. This is the Student Slant. So we've had a couple suicides within the last week at Ohio State, and I know the Lantern has gone back and forth on, do they cover it? How do they cover it? And it's having an emotional impact on the newsroom, kind of what you talked about, where we're covering fellow students who have chosen to take their own lives. How do you think newsrooms decide whether or not they should cover a suicide, or if they just always should because it's something, it's news?
One of the common themes that we see, and I worked on a grant last year with a colleague who is a clinician specializing in teen suicide, is that they are often treated as a spot news story, which means it's just the basic details, very little empathy, very little compassion, very little information to connect people to resources. It's just a death is a death is a death. While I don't want to minimize the effect of someone who dies in a car crash or tragic fire, a suicide death includes a whole other aspect of psychology and emotion that those stories do not, because of the stigma associated with mental health and also with suicide. In the Catholic Church, it's considered the unpardonable sin. So there's a whole lot of extra aspects to reporting a suicide death, and journalists need to start acknowledging that. Ignoring suicides and ignoring suicide coverage is not the answer. The Associated Press stylebook gives guidelines that if it should not be covered routinely unless the person is well known, a public figure, and that doesn't necessarily mean a celebrity. It could be someone well known in a small town, or if it occurs in a public place, because people are going to see the emergency vehicles there. They're going to see the tape around the scene and so forth, and they're going to want to know what happened, and there's an obligation at that point. But routinely, no, according to AP guidelines. I think that has to be the individual media outlet's decision as to what that threshold is. But our hope in the work with the grant and building the web portal of resources is that people will review what the clinicians recommend and that they will follow them and implement best practices when they do cover it. We've seen an alarming increased rate of suicides since the early 2000s because people don't want to talk about it. So ignoring it is not fixing the issue. When it's talked about openly and honestly as a part of the society in which we live and people are directed to resources, then folks who are contemplating having suicide ideation, they don't feel quite so alone, and they also know places where they can go to get support.
Yeah, you mentioned how there was a sort of a style book and like a guidelines on how to write a story like this, and you mentioned that when you were writing your own story, you published without a byline. What are some of the practices journalists should take to cover a story like this? You said it's spot news. There's not a ton of information, but what do we need to do to make sure that we take care of the story, to show compassion and at the same time give the news that we have to give?
One of the things that we talked about and recommendations that we gave to the student journalists, we visited 6 campuses around the state of Ohio as part of the grant, is to treat it as a proactive issue rather than a reactive. And it is a public health issue. So we're seeing a lot of discussion, and definitely so, on sexual assault, on cancer, on other diseases, but yet we're not seeing the same type of coverage on stories and issues involving mental health and suicide. So again, folks are not being directed to the resources. They feel that they're the only ones thinking about this, the only ones doing this. And, religious and societal taboos, they're afraid to talk to somebody else, and so the situation becomes worse. So, treat it as a public health issue. Find examples of those who are recovering, family members if someone has died, someone who tried to take his or her life. What turned things around? How is that person coping? Stories of recovery and resilience do matter. They do have an impact in terms of bringing rates down. And that's what we're hoping that journalists will do. It's a public health issue. Treat it as you would any other public health issue. You don't just wait till someone dies of cancer to start writing about cancer, okay? Mm-hmm. So do it, look at issues, look at what communities are doing, profile resources that are available so that it's widely known where people can get the support they need, rather than just relegating it to a typical, what we call in the business, a cop shop story, where something comes over the scanner, you get the basic details and nothing else, no context, no discussion about who the person was as a living human being. We need to do that follow-up in the days afterward. We also need to do follow-up again, 2 weeks, 6 months later, and that's difficult because in the 24/7 clickbait emphasized journalism world in which we live, it's really tough for a reporter to stay on a story and to continue to follow it, to devote resources when new things are happening all the time. So I'm hoping that reporters will have the discussion with editors. Let's not stop. Let's keep looking at this. Let's come back at this and see, has anything changed in terms of campus mental health resources as a result? And I've been in communication with the editor at the Lantern at Ohio State, and the president, thankfully, is now forming a mental health task force, and they're also looking at securing the area, which I'm not going to identify, but the area of campus that students have used the past academic year and already this academic year as a means to take their lives. And the reason I'm not mentioning the location is I don't want it to be advertised to those who may be listening and may be contemplating taking their own lives. Because, again, if a location becomes designated, becomes known, it can encourage others. Well, I'm thinking about ending it, so I know now because other people have ended their lives here, that's where I need to go to make this happen.
What you just touched on was an interesting discussion that we've had at Ohio State this week, where the location, we don't want to shed light on it and give people the idea, but at the same time, we don't want to ignore it. So how do you go about balancing those to make sure you're getting the right story out with the right amount of compassion? And at the same time, I know you came to Ohio State last year and talked about, what terms you use. You don't use the term committed suicide. So I guess just kind of wrap back around, how do you make sure you get the right amount of compassion in your writing?
One of the things that's important to do, and it may take a day or two, and the investment of time to establish some rapport and some trust, but is to show the person as a human being rather than a statistic. A typical cop shop spot news type story, the person is a statistic. We don't know the person's favorite color. We don't know what the person was involved in, what he or she liked to do. Family things. That person could have been a hero or a mentor, probably was to somebody. So who are these folks who knew this person as someone who was vibrant, alive, and contributing to the community? And it may take some time to find those sources, to give family members an opportunity to feel like they can open up and discuss it. Talking about it for many people is helpful. It is a form of therapy. Once something is voiced aloud, it no longer becomes a demon locked inside a person that can continue to torment that person. But talking about it with others, you find support. You also find those who have had similar experiences, and it helps in a way to build up a support network and help you find other people who can help you on the journey to recovery. So I would say treating the person as a human being, foremost. Again, I don't think we necessarily want to start finding people to blame, villains. That's typically another kind of news angle that we see after the Parkland shootings. Saw a lot of people blaming a lot of things. It was he was adopted. It was because of this. It was because of that. Just so many things to try to blame it. We need to be focused on the fact that a human life has ended, and someone somewhere is grieving the end of that human life, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how that person lived his or her life. Someone somewhere is grieving. So find those folks, reach out, be willing to be patient. Again, remind people of services that are available. Basic things. If you are feeling this way, if you are whatever, have clinicians talking about it, point to phone numbers and hotlines and resources that are available in the days afterward. I don't recommend crashing the funeral unless reporters are invited to the funeral, because that can seem macabre and very tasteless. But if someone says, we're going to be talking about him, her, friends and family, please come. And I think that's certainly appropriate, and to do so in a way that's the least intrusive as possible. Just keep talking to people.
Yeah, you mentioned the family and the community as well. How do you gauge that community standard on this sort of topic, or even the family standard? And if you want to report something that they may not want out to the public, how do you gauge that to know that you need to report for the greater good instead of just focusing on maybe a few?
Anytime you're covering an issue of trauma, it's important to clearly identify who you are, the news organization you're working with, the story that you're covering, and that includes the angle insofar as you know it. And I realize that sometimes once we sit down with a source, what we think is the story can change based on what we learn in the interview. And that can be a positive thing, that can be a negative thing, that can just be it's a different story angle than what we initially thought. Not good or bad, just different. So reporters have to remain open to follow the story, so to speak, but folks who are going to agree to be interviewed at one of the most vulnerable times of their lives need to know that someone is respecting that and is going to, to a certain degree, take care of that story, be very careful about spelling names and getting information exactly right, making sure if the family gives photographs to be used, that it's properly identified, properly credited, just basic good journalism. But it needs, there needs to be a couple of extra rounds of double checking and fact checking and confirming and making sure that your notes and the context of the story matches the interview that you had. And if you're concerned whether something is on the record, ask to clarify. Yes, that can give family members an opportunity to change their minds, but considering what we're talking about, they should be afforded that compassion and that opportunity to say, you know what, please don't use that information in the story. Because again, a lot of what's going to come out is going to come tumbling out, a lot of emotions packed and stacked with it. So they may not be self-filtering at that point. They may just be opening the floodgates and talking, and then upon reflection, probably a good idea to just go over what's in your notebook and say, let me just, review a couple of things here, make sure before I leave. A lot of people feel as though the media come in like vultures to pick over the injured and the dying, and even when it's just a politics story that doesn't seem to have a direct effect on someone, it is more so especially important to take that extra caution when we're dealing with people, the serious injury and the death, or the death of a loved one.
As we kind of wrap up here, I'm wondering if you are still doing the workshops you talked about going around, and you mentioned it earlier, the web portal you guys created. So I was just wondering, to kind of finish up, if you could kind of talk a little bit about these resources that journalists have and specific places they can go to make sure they're doing the best job possible.
The web portal that we put together is at M as in mom, HA.ohio.gov/suicide reporting. And that will take you to the portal. We have videos posted there. We have extended guidelines, brief guidelines, a suicide reporting checklist that reporters can just go through about half a dozen questions. Does your story include this? Have you double-checked this aspect of language? And so forth, as just very practical things for reporters to look at. A standard tag that should be associated with every story, with hotlines that they can call. I mean, at the bare minimum, even if it is a spot news story, include the tag to direct people to resources so that they read that and they go, oh my gosh, maybe I should end my life this way, and at least a phone number, give somebody a place to reach out, even if you don't do anything else, okay? I have cataloged some stories there that are examples of good reporting about suicide, bad reporting, and it includes national media organizations, national networks. It includes some local media organizations, some advice on what not to do, and so on and so forth. We hope that reporters will find this valuable and that they will use this. We're not trying to say don't tell the story. And two suicide survivors that we spoke with and that we used in one of the videos on the web portal, neither one of them said, don't tell the story, don't report it. What they said is, report it as completely as possible, include context, include resilience and recovery. Don't just look at it as who, what, where, when, why, and how.
That was a great discussion. Be sure to join us next week for more student perspective on the Student Slant.